Alright folks, I think it is about time to get started here. Just let me know in the chat when you can hear me, and we will get going. If you have any questions, now is the time to kind of start asking them, and we'll kind of run through just the notes real fast. Hopefully this will take less than half an hour or so to get you guys back to your evening and to your studying. And I'll try to point out the things that you should be taking a look at for sure. Alright, so let me get this over to this screen. Right, so this quiz is on absolutism. So if you didn't notice my little note to you guys when you first got in here, the quiz is going to be 35 points. This is 35 questions, 35 points. It's a little bit different this quarter. Actually, we will be allowing test corrections on quizzes going forward. So that is helpful for you guys too if for some reason it does not go well. So be mindful of that as well, and make sure you take advantage of those if you need to. So anyway, the age of absolutism, right? It's this time period, especially in Europe. Hello, Cat. He's here to say hello. Anyway, so the age of absolutism is a time in Europe where you're going to have monarchs, in particular, kind of taking more and more authority and claiming more and more authority and being able to wield this power absolutely, right? That's where it comes from. It means they kind of have absolute say in whatever they want, really. A lot of the things that you kind of need to be aware of, right, is that absolute monarchs, they centralize this power within themselves, right, and oftentimes they're going to eliminate the competition. Competition at this point is often things like people with power as well, right, so nobility, people with lands and titles and things like that, right, divine right. So divine right is this idea, right, where God created this monarchy, and therefore the royal family and the monarch is kind of a direct appendage of God, if you will, and therefore only answerable to God, right? And this, in a very religious Europe, especially back then, is extremely important, and people, buy into this, and therefore this is an extremely, big thing and big belief. So the first person that we talked about, why is this not going anymore, is King Louis XIV, right? And he is a member of this Bourbon dynasty in France. He is going to come into power in 1643 and will rule for 72 years, right? He is, I believe, still the longest ever reigning monarch in Europe. Queen Elizabeth's getting pretty close. And his rule is seen as this positive thing for France, right? And he's going to get this nickname, the Sun King, right? So, what are some things that Louis had to do in order to kind of take more of this absolute power, and what are the things that kind of went on during his time as king, right? So, for starters, as I was saying before, he needed to kind of subdue the nobility, had to kind of keep them under control, and these guys had their own courts and taxes, and being able to kind of keep his enemies close, and his friends close and his enemies closer are going to be kind of really important to Louis, especially when he builds Versailles and forces the nobility to live there and such, so he can keep an eye on them, right? The church is really important. If you're a divine, if you're an absolute ruler who gets your power from God without the church backing you to some extent, that could be problematic, right? So being able to control the church is a really important part of an absolute ruler, especially when claiming divine right. You also had a legislature in France. I wouldn't worry about dates at all, Carolyn. But anyway, the Estates General is really important, this idea of legislature, right? The legislature is a body that enacts and creates laws, right? And often can control taxes. So being able to eliminate this was one of the things that Louis did as a means of attempting to kind of, again, wield more power for himself and take it away from other people. So Louis is going to become this absolute ruler through the things we were just talking about, right? And he's going to be quoted, in French anyway, this whole thing saying, "I am the state." He is the all-powerful person in charge, and he's the one that kind of makes the everything work and run, right? One of the big things, and we did the whole assignment on Versailles, was the amount of power and wealth that something like this needed to show, right? It kind of symbolizes the royal power of Louis XIV and eventually the royal line, beyond that. And under Louis XIV, France is going to become kind of the greatest power in Europe, and that's why he's going to kind of get this nickname, the Sun King, right? So that it's a pretty prosperous time period in France overall. And yeah, so that's just Louis XIV right there. That's a more pixelated image of him. We watched the videos about Versailles and such. We did a little activity, so you should be aware of Versailles for sure. So let's move to Russia quickly, right? So we talked about Russia being ruled by the czars, right? Tsar is kind of getting its name from Caesar, from Rome. It kind of means this ruler, right? This king, if you will, emperor. So ultimately, I'll get to your question in a minute or two, Sydney. Anyway, the people that you need to know here, right, is Peter the Great. Less than that, Peter the Great will come into power in Russia and kind of change things. Peter the Great, under him, you're going to get a rapidly expanding Russia to the east and also to the sea, basically, to the west, to give them access to the ocean, and that's pretty important. So he becomes Tsar in 1696, pretty close to 1700. And similarly to Louis XIV, he is going to be reducing the power of the nobility and the landowners. He's going to attempt to do that, right? And one of those ways is with the creation of St. Petersburg. I'm not in a different setup, no. I moved some things in the room just because something happened, but anyway. Reducing the power of the landowners, right? He's going to force them to live in St. Petersburg and build homes there and things like that, which will force them to control of the land that's needed near the ports, right? St. Petersburg created this port, and if you remember, he travels west. He does this kind of circle of Western Europe. He learns a whole bunch of things and wants to bring it back to Russia and adopts these Western ways to some extent in Russia, right? Things like beards and other cultural things as well. He learned about dams and dikes and things like that as far as holding back the sea in Amsterdam. So he wants to do this similarly in St. Petersburg. He figures the Dutch can do it, so why can't we? So Peter the Great is here. This is the expansion of Russia under Peter the Great, which is a pretty big deal. And then we watched the video on him. So that's kind of it as far as the rulers, anyway. We can talk about church, controlling the nobility, and such are two of those big things you should know. Alright, so let me get this other one up here, go through the English Civil War quickly. Then I'll take whatever last questions, and if there are none, well, I'll leave you guys to your studying. Alright, so we are aware of absolute monarchs, right? This is just meant to be just kind of a recap. So the absolute monarchs developed through Europe through 1500, right? And there's going to be this constant struggle between the people in the country, at least the nobility in the country, and the rulers, and who can take power or more power or less power, and such, right? So the English monarchy is going to develop quite a bit differently than the rest of Europe, right? The monarchy had been limited by traditional English freedoms that had been around for a number of years. Things like the Magna Carta, which was signed in the 1200s, and certain rights that have existed for hundreds of years, even with kind of this idea of absolute monarchs. It's rights of the people that really weren't meant to be able to be infringed, right? So some of these foundations that you should be aware of, right, is this idea of common law. They had a unified body of law that had been formed by, over time. It's this thing that kind of develops over hundreds of years by the royal courts. You have a jury system, right? Trial by jury is in, again, 1500, 1600, as a pretty important right for people, right? majority of your peers kind of thing, right? The Magna Carta, right, guaranteed basic political rights, as we were kind of saying, jury trial, protection of law, no taxation without representation in Parliament, and such. And the king had to share some of the power with Parliament. So there's a bit of a difference in absolutism here in England and in the monarchy in England versus what you're seeing in France and Russia at the time, right? So in 1603, you are going to have the creation or the start of what's called the Stuart dynasty in England, right? There are a number of people you should be aware of, but the way I like to kind of describe it, right, and maybe this will help you remember it. Well, first you have James James 1, Charles 1, Charles 2, James 2. So how I kind of remember that is that it's a Charles sandwich, right, on James bread with Oliver Cromwell in the middle here. So just go down the line, right? James sandwich on Charles bread. It's 1, 1, 2, 2. So anytime it's just down the line, you got 1 and 2. James 1. The first time tree of Charles is Charles 1, Charles 2, James 2. Anyway, I don't know if that's going to help you remember it or not, but it's worth maybe thinking about. Okay, and again, Oliver Cromwell is in the middle of that sandwich. So, alright, James I takes over after Elizabeth I. He had been the King of Scotland before this, but when Elizabeth dies as the Virgin Queen, he is going to be the next in the line of succession, and it comes to him. So Charles I is the son of James I, and this is where things get a little tricky, right? Where Charles I is going to begin to kind of try to strive for this whole idea of absolutism in England, right? He's looking at France, he's looking at Russia, he believes in this whole idea of divine right and absolute power, and effectively is going to try to bring this to himself, right? So some of the things that happen with Charles I is this whole fight with Parliament over taxes, right? He's going to kind of end up starting this war with France and Spain. He's going to need money for this war, so he's battling Parliament as far as the funding for that goes. When Parliament refuses, Charles, one of the powers that he kind of has is to dissolve Parliament, and by doing so, this causes kind of a bit of a ruckus, right? So in the year 1628, Parliament is going to outright refuse to give any more money to Charles I for his wars, but unless he signs what's known as the Petition of Right. So the Petition of Right is this important document that's going to kind of, again, reiterate certain rights of the citizenry, of the people, of the nobles, and such, right? So you're not able to just imprison subjects without cause is one. Right, under Petition of Right, Charles I would not just have taxes without consent of Parliament, right? You couldn't house soldiers in private homes, which is a pretty big deal, and if you remember, it's actually one of the amendments to our Constitution here in the United States. That's how big of a deal it was back in this point. And also, he couldn't impose martial law in peacetime, right? So, Charles, he ends up signing this document, but ultimately he kind of signs it and makes them all happy and then walks away and just flat out ignores it. And when he starts ignoring it, he dissolves Parliament again. So to do, right, he dissolves Parliament, and now there's nobody that's able to really kind of stand up to him or trying to. To get money, he imposes more fines and taxes on his people, but in doing so, the popularity is going to kind of greatly decrease for him, right? So all of a sudden now you have a Parliament who's pissed off that they've been dissolved again, and they have a fairly charismatic leader, a man named Oliver Cromwell, who is going to kind of rally the troops, if you will, and he's going to gather up a bunch of people that are also annoyed from all these fines and taxes that are going, to the people to pay for his wars. So you have this now army led by Oliver Cromwell and such, and then you have an army that's led by Charles I and co, which are known as the Cavaliers or the Royalists, right? And without going into details of the actual fighting, Oliver Cromwell is going to win with the Roundheads, and effectively, when he wins, they capture Charles I and they put him on trial. He is ultimately found guilty for treason against the kingdom, and he is executed, right? And this is kind of a really important time period in English history because it sends this idea, right, that no king is absolute, right? If he really had the favor of God, would this been allowed to happen, and things like this, right? So this is kind of the message that's being sent, and it's a pretty large message, right? So when Oliver Cromwell wins, and he takes Parliament, and he is going to kind of rule England essentially, sort of as a dictator, if you will. He kind of passes laws that are more in line with his religious beliefs as a Puritan, which are a fairly strict version of Christianity, right? Things like no theater, dancing, sports, these things are seen as sinful. As a whole, they're going to be fairly religiously tolerant, but again, with this whole history of Protestantism in England, and then Catholics and such, they do not like Catholics. Joseph, I would say that you wouldn't need to know what that specifically means, I don't believe, but you should know, that King Louis and these absolute rulers have this belief that they are the state, right? That they control things. They are the absolute rulers. I don't believe that exact phrase shows up, but I have to look at it again to be honest, to be 100% sure. So anyway, when Oliver Cromwell dies, and we're getting really close to the end here, right? Parliament decides that they need to restore the monarchy, and they do. So they bring Charles II, and who I believe is his, I forget exactly if he's his brother or son, or let me look back here for a second. Anyway, I forget exactly who Charles II is in relation. I think he's probably just his son. And Charles II is going to respect Parliament quite a bit more, especially with how things had turned out in the first place. And as he's going to be a fairly well-liked king, he's not going to have any kids of himself. So when he dies on the throne, you're going to have the throne now go down the line of succession to Charles II's brother, who is also the son of Charles I. But James was actually Catholic, right? So you're going to have this kind of different viewpoint again coming to power, right? And James II, when he comes in, is going to elect more Catholics, appoint more Catholics to kind of offices. He's going to start to suspend laws, dissolve Parliament, and kind of, again, try to take more power for himself, which the public, right, and Parliament are not going to particularly be fond of, and they're just going to kind of seeing history repeat itself to some extent. He ultimately has a daughter with his first wife, who ends up being Protestant, and then a son with his second wife. But no one of these Catholics, they don't want a Catholic line of kings, so you're going to now get what's known as this glorious revolution, right? And what happens is Parliament invites James's daughter, Mary, right, and her husband William. They basically invite them to rule England. They kind of ignore the son, and basically they say, we will give you the throne, we'll give you the power, but in order to do this, you must accept this English Bill of Rights, and it establishes what we call a constitutional monarchy, right, where they have a constitution that protects the rights of the people and the nobility and Parliament and such, and we looked at that in class a bit. And William and Mary accept this, and ultimately they lead an army with their loyal subjects essentially to London. They more or less kick out James II, who runs the people in Parliament back, the sister, to kind of take control, and it works out swimmingly for them. So ultimately, the English Bill of Rights, right, and that's William and Mary, are the Glorious Revolution. So if you get asked a question, which I imagine you will, about the Glorious Revolution, you should again be familiar with William and Mary, right? So with that said, as far as I'm just checking forward and backwards here. With that said, the King, right, the English Bill of Rights is again, it's important because it sets a clear line of what the rights of the people are, right? And similarly to our Bill of Rights here in America and the Constitution and such. So things that are laid out in the Bill of Rights, that, again, important and will sound fairly familiar in some cases, right? The king cannot interfere with Parliament or making of laws, right? And that's pretty big deal. You're no longer going to have this this absolute power of a king, right? The king is by law, and having signed this essentially and accepted this to be put on the throne, they can't get involved, right? With the law process. Parliament has the power of the purse, so that means the money that the kingdom is going to be spending, again, is coming from Parliament to make those decisions and not the king, right? Again, another pulling away of power of the monarchs towards the people, right? You have this whole idea of habeas corpus. No person can be imprisoned without being charged with a crime, right? So you just can't scoop up people and imprison them without actually charging them with something and such. And also, as a result of that, no cruel and unusual punishment. Also, no Catholics on the throne. So, just again, this bitter taste toward Catholics and some of the issues that they'd had going all the way back to Bloody Mary and Queen Elizabeth and Henry VIII that we talked about earlier in the year, right? Okay, so anyway, before I finish up, I will tell you guys what the extra credit is going to be tomorrow, or I guess Tuesday. So what the extra credit question is going to come down to is what was the score of the meet that let them win. So the score was 72 Woodson to 78 West Springfield. Okay, so 72 Woodson, 78 West Springfield for first and second place. So it's pretty neat. It's the first time in school history, so that will be your extra credit question. So now let's finish this up, right? And it's golf. It's like golf, right? So the lowest score wins, if people are confused. But anyway, the outcome of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, right? England becoming a constitutional monarchy, again, is really important because it enshrines the power with the people and Parliament, less so with the king, right? So it's kind of this transition away from these absolute rulers. That is correct, 72 to 78. Woodson against West Springfield. And they were just 1-2 in the meet. There was a bunch of other teams. But anyway, England became its constitutional monarchy, right? Taking power away from the absolute rulers and putting it with the people. And that's kind of what B points out. And then lastly, C, right? You're also going to get a development of political parties now during this restoration, right? Because people have more of a say. You're going to have differing opinions on what's going on and what should happen, and therefore you have these political parties that are going to kind of begin to duke it out, essentially, with each other. So, anyway, expansion of rights, just in general, of your average Englishman. So that is essentially it. Let me kind of run through some of the questions here. I think most of them have been answered. There really weren't too many. So Sydney asked, are we going to need anything not on our notes, like from the Versailles worksheet or the trial? No, anything that is going to be asked should really come from the notes, pretty much across the board all year. So that you can rest easy on that a little bit because there's really not a crazy order of the family and things. So let's kind of run through that one more time, right? So I'll type it into chat, actually. Remember, I like to call it, you're not getting that, the Discord anyway. But I do like to kind of say, right, it is a Charles sandwich on James bread, right? So it's James the First. Charles, let me go back to that slide, actually. Make it easier for you guys. There it is. So it's James the First, Charles the First, and he gets dethroned, right, and ultimately killed. So you're going to get Oliver Cromwell in the middle. So I guess it's a Charles and Cromwell sandwich. Charles II, right? Then you're going to get James II. And effectively, then you're going to get William and Mary and the Glorious. Oh, what the heck just happened? I expanded this too much. Default view. Glorious Revolution. Did I just die? Oh, there I am. I don't know what the heck just happened. But anyway, okay, so that should be it as far as the order of the family. I would say that you should know this. And I believe there's a question talking about order and stuff. So however you're going to remember that, again, it's James and Charles 1 first, and then Charles 2 and James 2. So you're not going to get James 1, James 2 before Charles the first. A Charles sandwich on James bread, right? And you got Oliver Cromwell right smack dab in the middle. William and Mary and the Glorious Revolution to end it. Is that it? Any more questions? Is that good? If no more, then I will say that will probably be it. So I'll give you guys about 30 seconds to a minute to catch up and ask whatever questions you might have again. But on that note, I will be signing off and let you guys to yourselves, to your own studying. For anyone who didn't notice, if you got in here late, Sydney did make a Quizlet for Absolutism, which might be helpful. I will post it right here on the bottom again, that you can use. I'm sure she won't mind, and it could be very helpful. I haven't looked at it, but I imagine it's well done, so that could help you study. So on that note, since there doesn't seem to be any more questions, I will be signing off and see you all either tomorrow or Tuesday. See you, folks.